Well, I'm going to say welcome. This is kind of staggering. The panelists up here have all been sort of talking about all the people that are out there, which is really cool. We all know the topic today is our town, Warwick, and what happened in Warwick during World War II. I'm going to introduce our panel, more townspeople. Down at the end there is David Shepardson. David. Next to David is Mark Maynard, and Mark is kind of a ringer. He's a little bit younger than most of the people. There's a reason. He has great stories.
I did want to, I'm in good company. I'm in my 70s, so I'm glad to see glasses and hearing aids, because I've got both those things.
Next to Mark is Calvin Fellows. Calvin, welcome. It's great to see you. And well, I'm not even going to do the Clyde thing. Clyde's big on seniors and all that sort of stuff. Is Arlene, and I'm going to say Arlene Lincoln.
Right.
And that is correct.
Right.
And Arlene Lincoln is a very long time resident. And this guy next to me is a guy named Clyde Perkins Sr. Okay? Clyde. Okay. And the other contributors to this afternoon are you guys. We're not online, so that there aren't people calling in or texting or whatever in to be part of this. If they're not here, they'll have to catch up later. The reason for this event, and I think all of the oral history events, oral histories are different from normal written history where people do research and put down basically what their opinion is. You're going to get opinions from people who were actually, in many cases on this group here, present during World War II and in Warwick or communities like Warwick. And we're going to just sort of savor their, in many cases, firsthand experiences, which is the whole purpose of essentially oral history. Let me see now. With the bombing at Pearl Harbor, this country was, I'll say suddenly, and there are lots of quotes around that, thrust into World War II. The main thing about what we're going to be dealing with here tonight is the town of Warwick, and had Warwick and other towns like it had any preparation for this. And the answer is quite simply yes. World War II, rationing is a big piece of what probably we'll talk about here tonight or this afternoon. And the rationing aspect started actually in World War I, 1917 and into 1918, where they were essentially putting things by for the troops in Europe. About a decade later, the nation and Warwick was thrust into the Great Depression, which was a major event that taught people, basically townspeople, people everywhere, how to live with less or almost with nothing. So they were gaining experience. And then as early as the late 1930s, this country began to, somewhat quietly, not so, supplying Great Britain with basically everything Britain needed. Britain was in very dire straits, particularly after Dunkirk, which is when their military abandoned Europe, had to, and went back to England. So we have all of that experience, and then we have December 7th, 1941, is when the official war began. War was declared, and basically our world changed again. And essentially at that point, we really had to get down to business in terms of rationing and all of that. The federal government had basically two areas of mandate for communities. This is separate of the fact that they had to raise large armies and all of that. And I think one of the interesting things about raising the large armies, which goes back to the whole business of rationing and all of that, is that for every one man who was on the front line, the best figure that I've come up with, and I think Ivan and I both, is that it takes 18 people to put that one guy, say, in a foxhole in Europe or in Japan. So that it's very much a pyramid with one little guy or woman at the very top of this thing. But the support system for that person was huge. And the basic sense of all of that is that it took a lot of people to conduct the war as effectively as we ultimately did. As far as communities like Warwick and communities like New York City, the feds gave us basically two really major mandates. One of them was rationing, which we've already talked about, and that's what we're going to be discussing a lot here today. And the other was a very general category called home defense. And in a town like Warwick, did we have plane spotters? Yes, we did. Did we have a civil defense organization here in town? And the answer is yes. Obviously, you were closer to the coast. There were many other things that you had to sort of to be part of. So I think essentially we're going to start our general discussion around rationing, and I hope that doesn't skew anybody too much. If you've got stories and things about rationing, just a slight or a small item about rationing. It started actually in May of 1942, and the first item that was rationed was sugar, which we found rather amusing. Shortly thereafter, there was gasoline, oil, and all the things that one would normally expect. With the other item that I'd mentioned, home protection, civil defense, air raid wardens, and all that kind of stuff will be some of the stuff we talk about up here, and you guys also talk about. And it's just going to go from there. So that's really a very quick, maybe longer-winded than I thought, intro. I think we're really ready to go. And we have not talked among ourselves in terms of who would like to kick off with perhaps a little intro to what rationing was like here in Warwick or in towns like Warwick. So.
Well, I think David has
Well,
the book.
I get
Excellent.
all kinds of advertisements through the mail.
Cool.
And about a month ago, they sent me a ration book. So this is one that has not been used. I think somewhere in our cellar, there's one that's partially used. And there were a number of items that were in short supply because of the war, and so, for example, all my tires that I put on my car were rayon. It wasn't until after the war that you could get a nylon tire. And I never wore the tread off the ones I bought that were rayon. You'd hit enough stones on the side of the road, you'd get blowouts. You even use blowout patches inside the tires. Living on a farm up on Warwick on the west side, we didn't need as much of the food and so forth, but every Saturday night, evening, I guess, we would go down to the orange beef shop where you had a counter and then there were shelves on the back, and you'd tell them what you needed. They would get it off and package it up for you. And
David, I have a question for you. Were there specific items on your farm that you had to prepare and ship to some depot where they went to help the military situation or something like that?
not that I know of. We were a truck gardener
Okay.
family, and a lot of the produce went down to Orange, where they would load it on the trains,
And send it to
and it would
Boston.
go down to the farmers market in Boston.
Okay. Well, that's part of what we're looking at. Because you were sending food to them and then it was part of the rationing system there.
I remember my aunt telling me that when they sent a pint of raspberries down, the train shakes so much, they would take each pint and put it into 2 containers to use from here to the farmer's market. The other item that we sold on a regular basis was cream.
Okay.
We had about 10 Jersey cows, and we had a separator that separated the cream from the skim milk. So I've grown up on skim milk, and I'm still drinking skim milk today. The cream also went down to the railroad and went in the other direction, went down to the Amherst Creamery.
Okay.
And I think when my Uncle Clarence was doing it along the last container of cream that was delivered to the Amherst Creamery, I took down when I was a student at University of Mass.
Okay.
There are a lot of dandelions up on the hill. Dandelion greens were one of those things that was shipped to Boston.
Calvin, your family were primarily farmers during
Yes.
World War II.
Yes.
What sort of experiences did you guys have specifically in terms of the rationing business or preparing foods that would go to Boston, to Amherst, or to where?
I remember getting peanut butter in in tubs,
Okay.
little tubs of peanut butter.
And that came to you, your
The
family?
family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm curious right now as to what was going from Warwick out
Oh.
from your farm.
We were primarily a dairy farmer,
Okay.
and what milk we produced was not much. Was brought to Orange, what would be Hume Dairy.
Okay.
That's where the Hume machinery is sold today. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Arlene, do you have any memories of basically anything your family or anyone you knew produced and
Until I was 10, I moved to Warwick when I was 10, in September 1942. I
okay.
moved to Warwick. It was actually my 10th birthday.
And you were in Orange?
And I lived in Orange from that time. And we didn't have, we had a little garden of our own, but that was basically all we ever had until we moved to Warwick.
Right.
Then it was mostly just for our own use.
Yep. How about you, Clyde? You grew up in Petersham, which is a
Yeah.
small town
Yeah,
also.
not too far from here. I don't really have too much of a memory as far as that goes. I was born in '36, so I was only 5 years old.
Okay.
But I'm out of the agricultural background too. But I do remember that they were gasoline was one of the big issues for farmers, not having it or not being able to get it. And tires was another big issue.
Yep.
And those I do remember, but it was a dairy farm that my father worked on, but I don't know just how or what was done there and how it was shipped or where it went to or whatever. I do know later on that they was bottling it and selling it in the town themselves. So just when that started, it was probably going on at the time too that the Ledgeville Dairy there in Petersham was supplying dairy products for the residents of the town of Warwick. And that was one of the first jobs I had as a child, was delivering milk and dairy products to homes
Okay.
in Warwick.
Does anybody
I mean-
remember how gasoline was divvied up among the farmers? How that worked? I'm assuming that the ration book, which we started with, probably you had a particular color stamp, which was a gasoline stamp, and that farmers may have had a priority? I don't know, that's a question.
I have no idea.
Okay,
I know my grandfather had his own underground storage tank where he could put it 1 gallon, 2 gallons, and turn the crank for the vehicles. And a lot of it at that time was by, he had horses up until, 1938? When the barn burned and all the horses were gone. And at that point, my father made these jalopies. One of them was like a Dodge, another one a Rio. And you'd put 2 different transmissions in there to gear it down. And pull the horse-drawn equipment around with the homemade jalopy.
right.
Doodlebug, right?
George,
Call them
another question
doodlebugs?
or a comment?
What I just recently read about gasoline rationing, if you had an A sticker on your car, you were entitled to 4 gallons a week. If you had a B sticker, you were entitled to 8 gallons a week. But in order to get a B sticker, you had to agree to let other people ride to work with you.
Okay, carpool.
If you had a C sticker on your windshield, that was for like ministers, doctors, mail carriers, you know, something more essential where they needed gasoline every day. And then if you had a T, that was for trucks. I can't recall how many gallons a week they could get. But the sticker was on your windshield, and then that's all you were entitled to. And you had a card that the gas station filled out to make sure you weren't getting more.
So basically what you're saying though is that each farmer or each participant in this program had to self-monitor, or they could sit by the side of the road with an empty tank. So
Yeah.
they had to
So-
budget.
What was controversial at the time was it was an X sticker,
Okay.
and that meant you could get as much as you wanted.
Okay, George, who had those?
Well, wealthy businessmen had it.
Did everybody hear that? Wealthy businessmen
Is
had
this
the
weekly or
X
monthly? Is this rationing weekly or monthly, George?
Weekly.
Weekly, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Weekly. The other group of people that had the X was politicians.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Are you comic relief here, George? That's amazing.
I was just wondering, with the rationing, did the price of gasoline go up?
That's what I was
As
wondering
well?
too. Yeah.
Like, do people,
I
I don't remember
I
that.
don't remember, I recall it going up though.
they,
Pretty steady at
I don't,
9, 10, 11 cents a gallon.
yeah. and the
There were pretty
Want to
strict
repeat
price
that figure,
controls.
Cal?
12 cents.
What was that price?
9, 10, and 11 cents a gallon.
I remember 12 cents.
Oh, no.
They did have a speed
was all
limit
price
of
control.
35
Sure,
miles an hour.
absolutely.
Yeah,
yeah.
That was wartime, George? There was a lowered speed limit during wartime?
35 miles an hour.
Yeah, I did read that,
Yeah.
that was one way to conserve, as we
Yeah.
did in the 70s, you know, they weren't
Yeah.
supposed to
did.
go over 50 miles.
As we're doing right now, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
You know, it strikes me that as I look across the panel here, all of our panelists were probably at the oldest, maybe teenagers during the war years. I don't know, I may be stretching that a little bit, but I'm curious as to how children were sort of, did you as kids have certain things you were collecting? How was that done? Was there a place you took them in town or someone who, does anybody remember anything like that? Calvin?
I remember in school, we used to collect the aluminum foil from
yes.
gum.
Yes,
Okay.
I remember that.
And if we were lucky, we had somebody in the family, or unlucky maybe, but who smoked. And the package of cigarettes had aluminum foil. We used to collect that, ball it up, little balls, bring it to the town hall.
How about you, David? Was there anything, or one sec, Clyde's got a,
Milkweed pods.
okay?
In school, we picked milkweed pods. Put them in burlap bags, and they hung them up like a clothesline type thing and dried them off. And they were used for insulation in clothing for the people in the airplanes.
Life vest too.
You know, there was down insulation is what they used milkweed pods to get that
Yeah, no,
stuff. Yeah.
you know, where are we today? Huh?
Yeah. I remember bringing
Yeah.
10 cents to
We-
school every week to buy a stamp for a bond.
Okay,
That
it's
was
buying
was a big thing.
savings bonds.
Yep, that
war
was a big
bonds.
thing. Every week you brought 10 cents to school.
10 cents,
And you had a little book and you put the stamp in it, and when you had it was full, you could get a bond. I don't know if I ever got a bond. I remember the stamp. Little
Yeah,
things like
we
that.
would leave the school, they'd give us permission, we would walk down to the post office,
Right.
and what were these, 75-cent stamps?
Oh, no.
And you collected a whole book of those.
Yeah.
When you had everything full, you turned it in, and I think you'd paid about $18.75 for that. And
Yeah, I think that's
you
what
got
the-
back
right,
a
right.
$25
A bond.
war bond that
Right.
was, I think, good for, it was 25, 10 years after you got it.
I don't remember that. I remember the stamps amounted to $18.75, and when it was turned in, you got a $25 bond.
Yeah.
But it was 10 cents a week at school that we used to do that.
Yeah.
I remember that. So, yeah, things like that.
Wow.
Another one of the crops was the cream. And once in a while, we would splurge and whip a little bit of the cream. And I remember helping my grandmother do that. And my brother and I were a little too ambitious, and the whipped cream had flecks of butter in it. Also, we took some of the cream and put it into a mason jar and shake it
You get ice cream,
to make some butter.
some butter, oh, yeah.
My grandmother did
Yeah.
large batches, but we didn't over at our house.
My mother used to let the milk freeze and the cream would come up over the top, and she'd take that cream off and make ice cream with it.
Freddie, did you have something?
We had,
I was gonna say, about that time, while we were up on the farm and everybody had a cow, and my mother would make butter, and then it was summer people at the pond, and she would sell the butter that she made, and, you know, would have the little wooden frame that you'd put it in, have a little seal on it and so forth, and she'd make the butter. But the bonds, I can remember at one point, somebody would come up to the school and they'd
Yeah.
go around the desk and you'd have your little, you know, you'd get a stamp or something.
yeah, you had to
I
be,
do remember that,
right,
yeah.
and she'd
I don't
have
know
the
if I ever got
stamp.
a bond. I probably didn't get that.
That's what I said. I don't ever
Yeah.
remember getting a
That
bond,
was the
but I
carrot.
remember the 10
Yeah,
cents.
exactly.
Yeah, so, yeah.
But, did you do tin cans and paper and all of that? You
Oh, yeah.
remember your vegetable, well, of course you probably, well, you had your own vegetables, so I was a city person, so you probably didn't do that.
Well, Freddie, your experience was in Cambridge,
Yes,
so what,
well, it was probably much the same. I would assume that you, in the country, you had dark outs. I mean, we had wardens, we always had to have the house dark.
Oh, yeah.
We lived in a duplex in Cambridge, very near Harvard University, and We had a three-story duplex, and we had 90-day wonders that were there. And those were soldiers that came to the certain colleges, and they would become an officer in 90 days. It was a beefed-up program, and I don't know whether my parents got paid for it. I don't know whether they had to do this or not, but they gave up the middle floor, 3 bedrooms. Sometimes my parents had their own bedrooms, sometimes they didn't. And they would have the 90-day wonders. And then we went up to the top floor. And I have only
Lieutenant 90 days.
Yeah, right, yeah, I remember that.
And, the only other really memory I have of that is Madam Chiang Kai-shek.
Oh, I
And
remember
as we know,
that.
Chiang Kai-shek was the president of China at that time. And Madam Chiang, and I went to grammar school, 2nd grade I was in, because I was in 3rd grade when we moved to Warwick full-time. And at Peabody School I went to, and across from the school there was a big apartment building, and Madam Chiang Kai-shek came. And all of us had to go to the window and wave to her. I mean, what do little children know? We knew nothing, but she was a very important person.
Right.
From China. So that's, I don't really remember too much. I know my father worked long hours. He was he had a patrol service and protected war plans. My mother had the switchboard, and my parents at that time, I mean, they were very, very busy, like everybody was at that time. But that's about what I remember.
Well, that's,
Could you elaborate on that? When they did those tasks in war service?
The 90-day wonders?
No, you were talking about she had the switchboard.
Oh, no, she had a telephone answering service.
Okay, this was their ordinary
That, she had her
one.
own
Yeah,
business,
yeah,
but
I
then my
misunderstood.
father had the protected, he had a business too,
Yeah,
of protecting plants and so forth.
I see.
so did you ever see a cartoon in Collier's or the Saturday Evening Post? And your CO is standing there with this look, and somebody on the offside is saying, a 90-day wonder.
Right.
90-day wonder, yeah.
That's his problem, his excuse. In Warwick, we have another question back here.
Well, not a question, but 2 facts. My mother's still alive in her mid-90s. I remember her telling me you couldn't buy a tube of toothpaste unless you turned in an empty tube, because they were made out of lead.
Okay.
Wow.
Lead makes bullets. And Crest was still making lead toothpaste tubes in the 60s. I used to melt them down and play with lead. She also told me,
That's your excuse.
she also told me picking the milkweed pods, like Clyde said, but she said it was for making life vest. It floats in the water.
Okay.
Yeah.
2 other quick things. We used to go fishing with this Gloucester fisherman in the 70s, late 70s. He's dead now, but he told me, of course, people that made food didn't get sent off to war. Army crawls on its belly. He was a fisherman, and he used to go out and catch the fish, and German U-boats used to come up to get air, because they're off the coast of New England. And if you had a radio, the Americans, fishermen, U-boat surfacing at 2 degrees west, 9 degrees north, whatever. And the American bombers, planes would try to come out and shoot it in time.
Wow.
And he told me one submarine that was sunk. And he said sometimes the U-boat commanders would be benevolent, and they'd point their gun at the fisherman's boat and give you a chance to get into your lifeboat. Other times, if they weren't benevolent, they'd just blast it out of the water. One last thing, Charlie Brown, if he was here, he could tell us all kinds of stories. Is there any American World War II vet still alive in Warwick? I don't think so. He died in 17. I think he was the
I don't
last
think there are
one.
many alive anywhere.
No, I don't think so.
Very few,
No.
but-
There are very few.
Yeah. Does anybody on the panel or in the room remember activities that related to essentially civil defense? Did you
Oh, I
have air raid stuff and things like that? So, Arlene, why don't you start?
We had the little building up by the fire station, right near the fire station, and I can remember going up there and watching for planes. And you
Okay.
had a little phone, and you if you saw a plane, you had to call this number, and that's all they wanted you to do. And we took turns doing it, and there were several people in town that did that, but I can remember doing that. That little house was there for a long time.
Okay.
I don't know whatever happened to it, probably fell down.
David, you had a comment?
My father was a civil defense director.
Right.
So,
George Jr.?
yep. And my grandfather was the mail delivered from Orange
Okay,
and back. But when the Ground Observer Corps, I was part of that. My father had a shift from Saturday night till
okay,
midnight to 4 in the morning. And Harry Cloutier from Warwick, from Orange, came up because my father went up to the Fisk camp in Stoddard Lake in New Hampshire and helped him close up for the winter. And the last thing my father would say, oh, by the way, at 2 o'clock, remember to put the clock back to 1 o'clock. So he had, instead of a 4-hour shift up there, it was 5. My brother, myself, my mother, we all had shifts at the post. And you listened for the planes. When you heard a plane, you wanted to know what direction it was traveling. You reported it, even if you couldn't get all that information. You looked at how high it was, and if you could identify, a twin engine or something like that.
Did you have paperwork that had silhouettes or at least the outline of the aircraft on it?
Yeah, identification paper.
Yeah.
Okay. Calvin, you're nodding also here. Did the kids do this, or was it people in town, or how was that?
This was there it was there in the early 50s.
Okay, well,
And
there was
it's still-
another threat then.
Yes, and we did it then too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
in the
What
early
they-
50s.
What they were looking for were any of the, really they wanted the low-flying planes that would fly under the radar.
Right.
They had radar that was up quite a ways. And even now, there are planes go out of Westover that 2 or 3 come around together, and they're practically clipping the treetops.
Right.
And they're practicing flying under the radar. When you got that information, Orange, Aircraft Flash, 74, and I forget whether there was another number in there. And the telephone call went from Warwick to Orange to Greenfield. And over in Greenfield, they had a large table, probably as big as everything in here. And they would put model planes on there. When you reported it, they would put that on, and then they tried to pick it up from the next town and so forth. And they were able to identify them coming across. I think I went over and saw that facility once.
Was that in the Armory, Dave? Or is it a different building in Greenfield?
I don't know what the building was. I remember my father had a meeting over there, and I went with him.
That's cool.
Yep.
Okay, Clyde?
In regards to this, one of the things that we had to do was put black elliptical tape over the top half of your headlights
Oh,
if
yeah.
you was driving at night. So that in those days, you had these sealed beam headlights, and you could actually hunt coon with them, they were enlightening the whole world in front of you. And you had to put black tape over the first half of your headlights so that the airplanes wouldn't see them. So they couldn't see your light, so your light was all on the ground.
Even the town had blackouts. My mother would get a phone call. We'd be called into the house. pull down all the shades in the house, all gather into one room and wait. And for a certain period of time, in other words, the town has enough lights in it to be able to identify town after town. You can see them sometimes now. They fly so high now it's harder to see, but you can see which towns and which cities you're traveling over. And they didn't want them to be able to use the town of Warwick as one of those identification points.
Exactly.
They always had, when I lived in Orange, you had a curfew, and all the lights had to be out, street lights went out at 9 o'clock, and your curtains had to be pulled if you had lights on in the house. There was very strong curfew.
Did that last for the duration of the war?
Yes,
Okay.
it was quite some time.
How was that in Warwick?
I don't
Did
know
you
how
have a
that-
regular blackout at a particular
Yes.
time each
Did
day? Curtains were pulled?
Yep.
I only remember the blackouts, and on the blackouts, you'd eventually get another call for the all clear.
Okay.
This happened every day in Orange. It was just at 9 o'clock, all the lights were out, street lights went out, and your curtains better be pulled. So there was no light.
Calvin, was that the case here in Warwick? Did you,
Well, of course, I lived on a farm over there.
Yep.
And,
It's
but yeah,
different,
we,
yeah.
yeah, you did the same thing.
we had the same thing.
Went to
Same
bed
idea.
anyway.
That's it.
Had to get up for daylight.
No.
Now, changing gears just a little bit, what was the postal service like for rural towns? Was it regular? Did you get lots of news from people who were away? How often did it come?
We had a fellow over in the eastern part of town, Smith, came up daily with the mail.
Okay.
I suppose it was the same all over town, only different carriers.
Yep.
And on the western side, my grandfather would pick up the mail as he, in the wintertime, it would be a horse-drawn wagon. He actually, I think, had one of the first vehicles in town, but that went up on blocks and fluids were drained out of it for the winter. And he would pick up and deliver mail down to the Orange post office. And down there, he would pick up all the mail for like Route 78 coming up. And the post office was right over here around the corner. He would take the mail in there, they would then sort the mail, and then make a return trip. And I know some of the times, probably during the war, he took passengers
Sure.
down to Orange.
Sure. Sure.
Yep.
Well, that the mails were regular and so that, and Calvin, I'm sort of looking at you on this because you had a sibling who was lost in the war, near the end of the war, but nevertheless lost. How long did it take for that information to get to the family? And what was the effect here in town on losing?
I don't know how long it took, but I can remember the Army officers coming to the house and informing my mother that he had been lost.
Mm-hmm.
My older brother, I have a thing here that mother used to hang in the window. My older brother was a prisoner of war in Germany for a year. And
Steve, I can add a little to that. I know exactly.
Well,
what you
that's, I'm
mean.
getting to
Yeah.
you,
Okay,
because
well,
that's a major, go ahead.
yeah. Well, I think there was pretty regular U.S. Postal Service. However, it was affected by the war. I also know that the military, Tal says, the military was also really good, seem at least in the instances that I know, in notifying families of what was going on, and the American Red Cross, who had
Okay,
surprisingly, considering the level of war, access to information also. I do have a clipping from a newspaper sent to my grandmother, father's mother, and it basically just said that my dad had gone missing in Germany. No other details because they weren't going to release a lot more than that. But
And you didn't know whether it was the first or the second time, or?
right. Well, this was the main time. He turned up later, of course, as many people know, in a POW camp.
Tell the story.
Well, it's try to be brief, but there's a lot of info.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate to have actually all three of my children are way more computer literate than I am. I'm pretty technologically challenged. We're not sure when Dad enlisted. A lot of information about the services were lost in a massive fire. I think he enlisted, near as we can tell, sometime in 1943 or early 1944.
Do you know how old he was then?
That's the question. I know
Okay.
I know his age later in the war, but he was in the 106th Infantry,
Okay.
which ill-fated as it turns out later. He spent a number of years in the European theater. Managed to get 2 or 3 Purple Hearts and a bronze medal and some other medals. But he was, and I say the 106 was ill-fated because they were one of the front lines of defense in the Battle of the Bulge, which is one of the most famous battles in the war. They landed, I think, in Belgium and then came across the border into Germany. And my son was telling me, he had a lot of detail. He was in a brigade, I think the 423rd. And they normally would stretch those guys out over about 5 miles of line. But him and the brigade that they were connected with, turns out they were trying to cover over 20 miles. So pretty thin, spread pretty thin. And they got caught in the Bulge. And I believe it was Schonberg was the town. As that front went like this, they kind of got out ahead a little, and the Germans were able to get in behind them. Mm-hmm. And my dad was a scout, so he would have been out even further than some of the others. He was a sharpshooter. So they were captured at that time, and that would have been December...
Yeah, 1944.
Yeah, 19th maybe?
No,
20th?
44, 45.
1944. War ended in 45.
Yeah,
So-
we didn't go into Europe until December, so December of 44.
Yeah, the battle was December of 44.
Yeah.
So captured there, his unit suffered 80% casualties. So I don't think he ever considered it lucky where it ended up, but probably did ultimately. But they were then, prisoners were marched overland and then in cattle cars to the top of a mountain in Bad Orb, Germany. A hastily arranged prisoner of war camp. It wasn't meant to be a camp. It was a day camp for summer. It was a summer camp for kids. So buildings had no windows, no insulation.
Let me just quickly interject. Mark's dad was Emerson Maynard, who was a selectman in town, a postman in town, and he, I think, actually grew up in Orange.
He did.
But
he's
very much a part of the
Here's
local
what a
scene.
teenage enlistee looks like.
So he might have worn a uniform similar to what
I
you show here.
I have a uniform just like that in the closet.
There you go, right. And Arlene Lincoln can share more about that uniform. But
Yeah, Dad grew up in Orange. He's had family here and relatives here in Warwick at the time, but he grew up in Orange. He grew up on a dirt road. He was the youngest of 5 boys. Lived with his parents and his grandparents, so 9 people in a farmhouse. Pretty rustic. No electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing.
That was normal.
No central heating.
That sounds like Warwick. Absolutely.
Not all of Orange lived like that, but it was. But you're right.
It's normal.
He thought nothing of it. I mean, that's how he grew up. Although he did tell me much later, he said there would be 2 things he would never be after the war, and he readily, when we would talk about it, he said he would never be hungry again, and he would never be cold again in his life, no matter what it took. But
No X stamp for anybody in that family.
Yeah, exactly. So he was, and it possibly prepared him for the hardships he lived through in serving. He was in the camp. It took a number of days just to get to Bad Orb. Stalag 9 was the name of the camp. They had captured mostly English, some English soldiers and Americans. And it was pretty rough.
You mentioned that he said he'd never be hungry again. My oldest brother Bud was a prisoner of war in Germany, and he would very reluctantly talk about it.
Oh, Dick never did.
Yeah, it took Dad till well into the 60s before we could even talk
And
about it.
when Bud was in his later years, he would collect food. He was in a rest home, and he'd put it inside of his.
Oh,
He was never going to go hungry again. So yeah, it's those fellows went through some pretty rough times.
well, he celebrated his 20th birthday in prison camp. He was born on Christmas, so Christmas of 1944. He had just got into the camp, and that was where he had his 20th birthday.
Did you know that my cousin was with him?
Yes, yeah.
My
In
cousin
fact,
Francis.
there's a number of people.
They were in the same prison camp.
Yeah, that 106, and then those couple of local brigades. They concentrated on Massachusetts, Vermont,
Right.
Yeah.
New Hampshire, and I
Yeah.
think some from Connecticut. So a lot of these guys were certainly regional.
Yeah, they were quite local.
But he was, I think the fact that he was young and probably stronger than some of they put him to work. He was he was used to that, but he had a number of tasks in prison camp because he was able to. And again, of course, the camp, as the winter went on, he was there. He was liberated in May, so he was there almost 6 months, and the Russians liberated the camp in May of, and then he spent the balance of the war at a hospital in France, and then came back stateside.
Now, he escaped at one point?
Twice. He said they were very inhospitable after they captured him the second time.
Can't figure that out.
But he did, unfortunately, sustain some injuries that plagued him for the rest of his life.
Right.
Physical,
They all
serious
did.
physical injuries that.
Yeah.
And Mark,
They all did.
you know, other than him saying that he would never be hungry again, and he would never be cold again, he also said he would never be captured again.
No,
That's right.
I agree.
Yeah.
I didn't say that.
The first time, yeah, he said it was, they'd thrown this camp together so fast. It wasn't what you picture as a camp. There weren't these big monstrous tall walls and barbed wire all over. They did the best they could with barbed wire, but it was mostly armed guards, and both times he escaped at night. He was just able to slip out into cover darkness. The second time, got as far as whatever, there's a major river right nearby, no way to get across, and they knew he'd escaped once, and so, but he was recaptured a second time, and yeah, not an enjoyable stay. But the nice thing, and we talked about this a bit, never held it against German people. I mean, a lot of the German population were as much prisoners as they were, not to the extent, obviously, but they didn't have a lot of options. A lot of the general population in Germany did not have a lot of options. So
He got a view into that.
and he never felt badly toward Germans as a population.
Right.
Wasn't crazy about Nazis, but didn't really didn't hold anything against Germans.
Arlene, we have Dickie Lincoln's uniform,
Yes.
who is Arlene's husband, and we'd like to speak a little.
Well, let's put it this way. I didn't know him and after I'd lived in Warwick for 10 years when I met him, when I was 20. But his mom told me, because Dick never talked about the war. He was wounded in action twice. And his mother told me that she remembers Christmas Day, an army vehicle driving in the yard and two military men getting out and coming to the door and just saying, "Mrs. Lincoln, your son Richard has been wounded in action," and that's all they told her. And she had two other boys. She had three boys, and all three of them were in the military at World War II.
Wow.
So she told me more about him being in the war than he drove a tank. I know that. I have pictures of him on the tank. But other than that, I don't know much about his service when he was in the service.
Right.
But
I think that's a pretty common denominator among
yeah, it
people
was.
who fought both in Europe and
Yeah.
in Japan or in the Japanese
But they
theater.
don't offer it. When they came, his mother-in-law said it was like the biggest shock of her life, and she said it was months before she knew if he was alive or dead, because they didn't tell her anything except that he had been wounded in action. And then as soon as he was well, they put him right back out again, someplace else. They didn't send him home.
He was in Europe?
He
for
was
the
in Europe.
duration?
Yes, he was in Europe. Yeah, he was in it's right here, the 441st AAA Battalion, Armored and Mechanized Infantry. This battalion fought its way across Europe from Sicily, Italy, Anzio, Rome, France, Western Germany, and Central Germany. He was drafted. Dick turned 18 on October 22nd. He was a senior in high school, and he was drafted immediately. And he was overseas in December. That's how fast they took him, and there's not, like I said, he wouldn't talk about it. He always said it was a job. I did my job. And that was it. He was very proud of being in the military. But
Well, does anybody else have more comments?
I have
Freddie?
a question.
Please?
Was there a sense of supporting the families who had people that enlisted? So, there was one less person in the family. So I just wondered if you sort of were in some way supporting one another or awareness that way? Or wasn't it talked about? It just, because you were all participating in your own way that you so explained to us.
as a child, we did a lot of letter writing.
Okay.
He wrote, that was a big thing. My mother insisted that we write. I had two cousins and an uncle that I knew of. I didn't know Dick at that time, that were in the military. And I wrote letters, and you had to say your prayers every single night, and she made very sure that you prayed for them and wrote to them. It was, and it was kind of, for a child, it was sort of just part of your life. It was like there were these posters around every place that told you don't speak to anybody, be quiet, and do all this kind of thing. And in school, things were very patriotic. The thing I remember when I came to Warwick at 10 was that it was quite different, being 2 rooms, 8 grades. So I was in, 4 grades to a room. We had a lovely teacher, was it Miss Tyler? Miss Tyler, she was she was a lovely lady, very patriotic, and all we used to sing patriotic songs. And I can remember when I first came to Warwick, in 1942, we did a program that was all patriotic songs in the town hall. And I don't know, it must have been maybe what was Armistice Day then. Now it's now Veterans Day, but Warwick was very patriotic. But it was, coming from Orange, it was a big school, quite big, but Warwick was very, very patriotic. So it was just...
We showcased Emerson Maynard on Veterans Day at the town hall, because Dana was in kindergarten.
Yeah.
And I remember, it's like he said, I've never represented my war service. And then he died shortly thereafter.
Yeah, he died young. He was 68 when Dad died when he was 68.
Right. So it's nice to hear the letter writing and that. Thank you.
Oh, that was very important. We didn't go to bed at night unless we made sure one cousin or the uncle got a letter. you know, and always your prayers, and so you have to say your prayers, so we did a lot of that, so.
Calvin, you have?
Yeah, during World War II, the population of Warwick was about 450. That's men, women, and children. And if you count the names on the honor roll, those who served in World War II, you will find the names of 57 men and women. In other words, if there were 100 children in town, we know there were 87 young people in grades 1 through 12. Approximately 1 out of 6 adults was in the military from Warwick. This meant that nearly every household was affected by the war. Either they or their neighbor sent someone off to defend our freedom.
How many in your family?
In my family, there was my oldest brother, Bud, in prison of war for a year. When he died for his country in 1944, Virginia was in the military Marines. Stanley Weeks, my brother-in-law in the Air Corps. Walter Gillespie, my brother-in-law, was in the Navy. Peter Antonio, Virginia's husband, served in China, Burma, and India. Lyle DeGuerra was a pharmacy tech. And Eddie Spoon, Ruby's husband, was in the Air Force. I was in the Air Force. My brother Ted was in the Air Force. Oh, he was in the Army, I'm sorry. So that we had 8 members of the family in World War II. So, were we affected by it? Yes, we were. Like I say, I lost my brother, and Bud was a prisoner of war. Virginia went into the Marine Corps right after the war, so I don't want to say she probably enlisted in 45. Ted was in the Army, I was in the Air Force. So in our family, we served our country pretty well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I had 2 brothers also.
Yeah.
They were in Korea. One was in Korea, the other was in Vietnam.
My dad had 2 brothers besides himself. 2 of his 4 brothers were also in
Right.
also in the armed services.
And I might say, if you can expand the family out, he's a cousin.
We're all related one way or another.
Don't have to expand it very far either.
Well, I'm sure that they're right there.
One quick factoid, not so much rationing, but the bomber that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan was called the Enola Gay. Maybe you didn't know this, but the Germans are working on heavy water experiments, atomic stuff also at the same time. And I guess the Allies, I think it was in, I don't know where it was, in the fields or something, they found a hangar that had a German plane that was capable of transatlantic flight, which was important to do long distances without refueling. And they called that plane the New Yorker because they had planned on bombing New York City. Did anybody else know that fact?
George, was that a jet by any chance? Because the Germans had also, when the war ended, they hadn't been able to produce them. They made a Messerschmitt, it was a ME-262, and it was a jet.
Yeah, so my neighbor was an army, and he told me about seeing a German jet. But that bomb, I don't know if it was a jet or prop, I don't know. But did anybody ever hear that fact about the New Yorker?
One of the first jets.
It's like a hidden history fact.
Right.
I had to learn that.
Another hidden history fact, my uncle in California, this is okay to put in, because it tags onto George's story.
That's the California part of Warwick, right?
Right.
Okay.
Because he was stationed along Long Island during the war. He lived to 104. And one of his most memorable experiences, because I asked him when I saw him, you know what, and he used to have to walk those beaches along Long Island, and he had a cigarette, and according how he showed the light in his cigarette was signaling whether he saw subs in the water or not. I said, you gotta be kidding me, a cigarette? He said, yes, that's what we were doing. He was also working with the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover That's a different story for another time maybe, but
Where
Yeah.
on Long Island?
I'd have to look that up. It's
'Cause there
all
was
been
a
recorded and.
Group of Germans who were landed on the beach in a town, I think it was Amagansett or Watermill, which is out in what is now sort of referred to loosely as the Hamptons. And it was the whole story, if anybody's interested, our librarian could probably assist. And I want to say it was 43, I'm not sure, but part of the group made it to New York City. But they were not real they were all Nazis. But as soon as they were here, it was kind of like, I think maybe. So, but
Well,
that was.
speaking of the library, I wanted to just add something very quickly. Freddie, our ace volunteer here, suggested the other day, why don't you check out the town annual reports? They might have something interesting to shed. So I did pick up the volume, which has been sitting on the shelf for 70 years. I don't know the last time somebody picked it up. Nothing, of course, for the 1941 year because we didn't enter till the very end of the war. But 1942 has a bunch of stuff. It also starts off with a list of the Warwick men serving in the armed forces of the Allied nations, which is about 20 or 24 people, which is interesting because Cal just mentioned there were some 50-odd total who during the total course of the war. Obviously, there were a lot more. So 1942 is the year where there's a relative, a lot of mentions of war-related stuff. And then I think for 43 and for 44, there's almost nothing because I think everybody was just so busy that they didn't have the luxury to try to, what were they going to say? Yeah, things are tough and we're doing the best we can. I did want to just mention very briefly, there's one entry in the 1943 report, which comes out at the end of 1943, where the superintendent of schools reports, during the summer, much has occurred on the war fronts to create the feeling that perhaps we were at last on the road to victory. Because as many of you know, things were not looking that great for the Allies until well into the conflict, and things only really started to turn later in 43. So I found myself, just sitting here listening to everyone and imagining, it's not like we knew we were going to win. It's not like it was a done deal. And I'm trying to imagine what it was like being alive at that time, whether you were 5 years old or 50 years old, and just the daily experience of getting up in the morning and wondering, what's going to happen. And then, of course, even when the tide started to turn, there was no guarantee. So anyway, just a little bit from the town annual reports. Thank you for that suggestion, Freddie.
And Freddie suggested this topic too as well, so thank you for that.
There is another part that I remember from this, and this is my mother being so involved in the Women's Auxiliary, which was part of the thing, and actually she has a marker on her grave as being a veteran of that, by being in the Women's Auxiliary in the town of Petersham. So I imagine that the same thing was going on here in Warwick, where they would get and do whatever ladies do. You could tell me, wrapping bandages and whatever they were doing, whatever they needed to do, they would do to support what was going on. So perhaps somebody can fill in some stories in that regard.
Well, women virtually ran most of the major manufacturing factories in this country during the war.
Right.
Rosie the Riveter wasn't just one woman on a poster. I've got some automotive. I have an interest in older automobiles, and there was during the war, of course, car production stopped. You couldn't buy a 1943 or 44 anything. I think some late 42s got into the market, but they just stopped. They switched over to heavy armaments, and it's an amazing. I want to over 80%, I think, of the workers in factories were women. Of anything, they were welding battleships. They were putting tanks together. Men were gone, and women basically ran the manufacturing in this country for the balance of the war.
Well, I remember my dad worked in Irving Paper Mill during the war, and he would go to work one day and he wouldn't come home for 2 or 3 days because he would sleep there. They had a little diner outside of it, And that's where they would eat, but there was so much work that he would just stay right there and work until he had to come home, so.
Arlene, what were they doing at the paper mill? Have they changed production to something different than normal paper? Or?
I don't know what they're doing now, but at that time,
that-
they were making napkins and toilet paper
Okay,
and this
all
type
for
of
the
thing.
military.
But-
Tissue-
and this-
tissue mill.
Tissues and things like that to send over, yeah.
Freddie?
Was reading a little bit about this topic, and I tried to look at some of the factories that were in this area. And Starrett's went to 24 hours a day. They
Yeah.
had 3 shifts.
They did.
And I forget the numbers because I didn't write them down, but their output was so much greater, of course. And Calvin's father worked in a shoe factory, that Anson shoe factory, and I couldn't find out whether that was longer. But a lot of the factories, even here, were working longer
All the
hours
time.
to produce what was needed for the war effort.
Right.
So, you know, you don't have to go to the big factories, even the smaller ones were doing really their part.
Are there any more questions, comments? I'm sure everybody, once you file out, you'll start thinking of things that, gosh, we had them there, we could have asked, but,
Clyde had an interesting, when I was talking to him, asking him to be on the panel. Do you want to share about just your first
Well,
encounter?
actually, my first conscious memory that I have today is December 7th, 1941. I had just turned 5 years old, the end of October, and I remember the adults around me changing very dramatically and had no clue as to what was going on or why or anything like that. And that was my first conscious memory that I have today is that day. And just the reaction of the people around. I have seen something similar to that since, and that was in the one there, 2001. And there was that same shock. You know, although Arlene was sitting, we were talking before this started, and she's a little bit older, and she was saying that they had been expecting this since '39,
Right.
but you know, to me, I had no idea what was going on outside of the fact that the world had changed. That I know, but I didn't know why.
I think that our parents protected us from what was going on. I mean, we were children. Children didn't know everything then, like today they are exposed to everything that happens, and they probably, little children today would be traumatized if they saw everything that was going on the television. And we knew what, like, my mother had a brother who was in the Bering Strait. He was in the Navy, and he was up in the Bering Straits. And my father's brother was in the Navy, and he was in the Pacific and came back with jungle rot on his hands. He did eventually get over it, but had to wear gloves on his hand. And we knew they were in the service, but it didn't really mean too much. Everybody was, it was your life, and you didn't think, even though we had blackouts every night like you did in Orange, of course in the city we did too, but I don't ever remember being afraid. I mean, it was just...
No, we weren't, it was nothing we were afraid of, it was
No,
just something
it
you
just-
lived with.
Exactly, yeah.
It was
And
your
I
day,
think
what you,
today, I think that kids would be petrified, you know, if they
No.
could see...
no, I mean, it was in
everything.
school, they talked, you know, it was freely talked about, and things you did in school were very patriotic, and
Right,
it just was a part of our lives.
right.
But we didn't have the visual images that you have today.
No, no.
We didn't have the visual images that you have today
No.
with the television and
No, no.
the internet and all that so forth. You just rode your bicycle or whatever you did, went out and played, you know. You weren't immersed in what,
Right.
in the news of the world. You just had your own little world, and that's where you were.
The only
You
time
didn't
I was
interfere.
ever,
To do certain
Yeah.
things, your tin cans and your paper and your your foil and all of that, and you just did it. Now,
And save the string, the balls of string.
Yeah.
Did you save string?
Different, but, you know,
Freddie, I think there's something that Arlene said earlier, and that is just simply, it's just part of life. And
Right.
the point is
Life.
that everyone here on this panel essentially came of age during that period of time. So their experience, having come out of the Depression and what life was like then, and then moving into World War II, this is kind of what it's like. And today our lives are pretty different. There are so many things that are bombarding us all the time. So, I mean,
Such freedom. There's more freedom now. I mean, then it was.
yeah, that's probably up to the
And also,
but,
you have,
Right.
quickly, David?
I had two uncles who served in the Pacific. One was in Washington and flew out to the islands once in a while. They both came through the Sea Scout program in Montague. And so they were sailors.
Okay.
So Warren Welch did that flight. He got some overseas duty because of that. My Uncle George was kind of teed off at that because he spent his time in the hull of a sailboat sailing off Japan listening for subs.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, he had the boat and captured and so forth. He might have gone down with it.
Jim, question?
When you came around to talk about the fact that many of you were kids at the time, and you know, Arlene, you were talking about, and several of you about real adult responsibilities going up and watching for planes and recording and following this structure, but and you know, having this real awareness and very, you know, patriotic regimen at school, and I was thinking this earlier, and then I really didn't want to go there because the seriousness came back to the fore. Calvin talked about your brother and Mark, your dad, and all, and folks getting or dreading receiving that letter or visit. But you're also kids. I was kind of curious when you were talking about those responsibilities. How did the kids process this down as kids, and how did they cut up about this? I'm sure they did.
You just did what you were told, and that was just a part of our lives. I mean,
I think I'm asking something a tiny bit more play and transgressive.
You know, Jim, I can respond to that in one way. I was stationed, I was a kindergartner at the George Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert during the Korean War. And there was a regimen that all of us kindergartners, I won't say get used to, but we knew what it was. And it was usually an officer or two, and they would come to the school. And I remember one child, Trudy Mahurin, I remember her name, and her father, who was actually, you could probably Google him and find it, he was a rather famous fighter pilot who was missing in action. And they came, and it was amazing, the pall that sort of fell over the school when they arrived. Everybody knew exactly what was happening, and they left, and Trudy wasn't there to talk to, but, and I don't think we actually saw her again. But it's an event that happens, and you sort of get used to it, but we processed it by, whoa, okay, it's Trudy's dad. And there'd been rumblings that he had gone down.
I was asking something much less serious. I realized that, and maybe it wasn't less serious because that reality was there. I was asking how this worked out in your play. How you know that you're dealing with this Paul, with this heaviness over you, with these responsibilities, but you're still kids, and this works out in kids' play. This works out.
I'll go back to Arlene. It's just part of life. You processed it quickly.
Right.
You didn't dwell on it.
No, it was
you went on
schools, church,
Kids didn't
home,
analyze
that's all you knew.
things like they do today. I think that you just did what you were told.
You did.
You didn't ask why. You didn't ask why.
I'm asking something more analogous. The children of the plague and Britain ended up developing Ring Around the Rosie.
Yeah.
You know, that tells us, but it works into their play. That I'm not talking so much about how you process your trauma It's how this worked into kids being kids, is
Oh,
what
you-
I'm
You
curious.
develop games Cops and Robbers, only it was Allies and Germans, or,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and you develop games that way, or, you know, Japanese, they call them Japs, you know, and everything, you build games around it
Yeah,
also.
that's kind of what I was wondering.
Yeah,
ask
you
the
did.
series about. Yeah.
And I think that I can remember, particularly little boys, they would draw pictures with the planes and all the shooting you would see, and they, you know, that would be something they would do, but I don't think they internalized it so much, but they would just, I can remember, I think even my brother, he would have been, first grade, I mean, I think even when I was second grade,
your
he
play.
behind me, we were, you know, but I think that kids did that, I think they knew, but they didn't really know what it meant. I mean, you know.
Well, we used to go to the movies on Saturdays when I lived in Orange. That was our big thing. We could go to the movies. And the first thing in the theater was the news. And that's about the thing that you saw the most of what was going on. Otherwise, you didn't have television, or even the newspapers didn't have the pictures that you saw in the movies. But it was just, that's what it was. It was just part of our life.
I suppose
You know.
a lot of people listen to the radio. I don't really
Oh, my
remember
dad.
that, but I remember Jenny saying if she, you know, had been able to be here.
Oh, that was
She
a-
said that she remembered listening to the radio. you know.
There was a time in the day that you didn't open your mouth. When Dad was listening to the news, you just got out of that room. Otherwise, you know, you were in trouble, because he would sit right there and just listen to it, you know, and, you
But the
know.
news was at a scheduled time,
Yes,
every
it
day.
was, yep.
It wasn't
Probably 6 o'clock.
back-to-back
or-
news like we have today.
Today it's constant,
No,
yeah.
it was-
No, no.
A half-hour news, and that was it.
And we know a lot of things today that really we don't need to know. You know, you know, that's the thing.
Freddie,
so.
would you share about the watches? That was like new knowledge to me when you shared about that.
What's that?
The watches.
Oh, the watches. Did I? Oh, I think that you have a copy of that I gave you. When a soldier from, a boy from, or I don't know, there probably were some women, your sister, maybe others also. The town would give them a watch to wish them good luck. And there was, I suppose, a fund, and actually, I think I gave my copy,
We have a list of the people who donated
a
for the
list
watch
of
for
all
one
the
of
people that
the,
donated
one
in
of the
town.
enlistees.
And actually, Calvin and I were going over it and remembering most of the people. There were maybe 2 or 3 we didn't know who they were, but
Dozens of people.
And then I think someone has suggested, which was probably true, it probably was a general fund that, and you know, that everybody participated, and not like this one person and then the other person. It was probably a general.
I don't know, I think this piece of paper is like the people who contributed for the watch for Joe Smith or whoever it was.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. And so, yeah, I.
And it was
forgot
great,
about
and
that.
next to the name, 25 cents, 10 cents,
And what-
but you had about
It didn't have the-
50 people.
It didn't have the amount next to it. It didn't have the amount. that
Oh,
they
I
donated.
thought, okay. Oh.
No, I think, yeah.
Maybe that was your suggestion, but
We
the
were- no, we
the
were
amounts
ta-
were small.
We were talking
but-
about, when, the Bowers over here,
Arthur?
Mrs. Green,
Arthur,
Arthur?
what was her name?
Arthur Bowers.
No, but the lady that, his
Oh,
mother,
over here.
and she used to, if somebody was in the hospital.
Mildred.
And then they would call around and everybody would, and that would be
Oh,
a
yes,
quarter or 10 cents,
yeah.
15 cents,
Yeah.
and people would donate.
We always
And then
did
they
that.
would send flowers or give them
Yeah.
money or whatever the
Yeah.
case might be.
Yeah.
I think, that's what that was.
Just bring Mildred a quarter and they'd get a bouquet,
Yeah.
something happened, yeah. We did that for years.
I think there's one more thing that really needs to be cleared up here. And that is that at Kulik's, there was a special either handshake or number. And if you had that special, whatever it was, Harry or whoever the butcher was, you could go with Harry and you would get an extra slice of or an extra cut of.
Wow.
Does anybody know anything about this? Or are we all just
I
gonna
think I
clam
told you
up?
that story that my father said. told me
Yes,
that.
well, it's been running around among us. It's a great story.
Yeah.
And can anybody shed any light on it? That there was a magic number or,
Or some kind of a code or something.
yeah,
that-
exactly.
Yeah, and they would go into a local store, and then, you know, if they wanted a good cut of meat or something, and the person then would go back and get them a good cut of meat, but if you didn't know that special.
Probably the rich people and the politicians.
Just the guys with the X's on their cards.
Was that in Cambridge?
No, that's Winchester, New Hampshire.
Winchester, really?
Yep.
Oh, really? I remember when Coolidge was on Keene Road. Before they, yeah.
Yeah.
Well-
It was over on Keene Road. I remember.
We just
they-
want to know what that secret
Yeah,
code was.
I remember, but I don't remember. I don't know. We used to go there, but I don't remember.
Well, you weren't privy to it, but probably your mother or father was.
I don't know. Maybe they did get it, and I just didn't tell me. I mean, why would they tell me they got an extra slice or something? So.
I want to just add one little piece. I know we're kind of, I think, getting ready to wrap soon, but any, you know, of course, final thoughts from people. But when we were talking about, you know, first panel, what should we do? And we started thinking about, you know, World War II. Wow, what a big event. And wow, so long ago. It wasn't just the poignancy and the importance of the event in so many people's lives and the history of the town. But another element was the fact of the awareness of how people in town really had to come together and help each other to get through it. And having just gone through, and perhaps still going through, the whole COVID thing, it seemed like there was a resonance with something much more recent, which is a small community like ours doing its best to pull together, to help each other out. And I just think it's a useful context to think back on the war as almost, if you will, ancient history, although not really ancient because we have people who were, you know, actually alive. But it's also a reminder of...
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm...
You know, people coming together in crisis and doing what they can to help each other. And I think that's a good, you know, if there's a positive spin on thinking about, you know, these terrible years, that, you know, that was the good side of it, is that people came together. And I guess, you know, I'm a newcomer, but it seems to me Warwick has always been that kind of a community where the town has come together and supported people as needed. And that's something that is still part of our reality today. That's not just history. And who knows what's in store for us, you know, ahead. So to that extent, these war years are kind of a symbol, if you will, of, you know, people on the home front doing their best to get through really hard times. And on that note, I'll turn it over to Steve maybe to kind of wrap us up. But again, if people have final thoughts and
I think any questions, comments? I mean, I think it's been a good session. It's been fun visiting with everybody, which is kind of what this has been, and sharing. So the panel, thank you all very much. And I should all warn you that you may be called again. Thank you.
It was fun.